Hello and welcome to this week's edition of Think Big. I'm your host, Akia Garnett. Thank you so much for tuning in. I am joined in the studio by two amazing guests, two rock star professionals that you're going to learn a lot from tonight. I am so excited because the topics that we're talking about are really important right now in the business community. So many small business owners, entrepreneurs, and to be quite honest with you, large corporations are struggling with some of the challenges that we're going to talk about tonight, and hopefully we'll shed some light on ways that you can move your brand to a higher level of excellence. You can install some of these ideas that we're talking about, test them out, and you can also follow up with us and let us know how that went. It would be wonderful to hear back from you. So without further ado, my first guest is Anne Marie Malecha, and she is a senior vice president at Dezenhall Resources in Washington, D.C., and you focus on crisis management?
I do crisis management and public affairs.
Great. Tell us about the work that you do at Dezenhall Resources.
So we do two things, crisis management and public affairs, which is issues management. We help corporations, large and small, deal with the issues that are happening today in their businesses, operational challenges, legislative challenges, crises that happen in the media, both traditional and social media, as well as dealing with surprising catalysts that pop up in the course of doing business.
Wow, that sounds really exciting. Who is your ideal client?
My ideal client is someone that is in a position to fight back. Most companies today have motivated adversaries, and those motivated adversaries range from anything from a disgruntled reporter to the plaintiff's bar to NGOs to activists, and even sometimes the angry teenager in their parents' basement.
Right.
So we're looking for corporations that have issues where they want to advance their message and ultimately create a win for themselves so they can continue to do business the way they'd like to be doing it.
Right. I mean, you make motivated, what did you say, motivated?
Adversaries.
Adversaries sound so positive and exciting.
It is exciting, but for corporations, it's a big deal.
Right.
It's something they have to consider. And
Yeah.
motivated adversaries can be, just about anyone, and they come in all shapes and sizes, and keeping track of your detractors
Right.
is a critical component of doing business today.
So much is going on. What is it like to be in crisis management today?
There's never a dull moment.
Right.
So much of what I deal with has a legislative or political lens that we're looking at things through, and when companies don't have the predictability that used to exist just a few years ago, it's really difficult for them to make decisions, and unfortunately you can't sit idly by and do nothing.
Right.
Action is still necessary, so every day is a little crisis of its own.
Mm-hmm. I mean, I want to talk about some of that, do something later.
Sure.
But one of the things that I've read that you've mentioned in the past is that it's good to try to narrate the script as soon as something, breaks. Of course, we don't know when something is going to break. It's kind of hard to time something like that. But once it's out there, you've talked about just trying to find a way to get in front of it.
Absolutely. I mean, shaping the narrative is critical. Just about every story that happens, whether it's in the traditional media or the new media, follows the same construct where there's a villain, a victim, and a vindicator. And oftentimes media see themselves as vindicators, and that's okay. But if you're not a part of the conversation when a narrative is created, or your allies aren't part of it, oftentimes you as an organization or a prominent individual become the villain.
Right.
And that's something that is critical you try and move away from.
Right. I mean, how did you get your start in this line of work?
I started in politics, and anybody that's been in politics understands that just about every day is a crisis in its own right. And I was in legislative politics on Capitol Hill, and every bill that we wanted to have passed was an issues management fight. And I really learned that outside influencers, whether they be allies or constituents in a district or companies that were a part of the community that members were serving, matter. And you need air cover, and you need a cohesive message, and you need to be able to get supporters that don't work within the halls of Congress to help you advance your platform.
Wow. I mean, when do people actually call Dezenhall?
There are two types of people that call Dezenhall. The people that are in the thick of it and should have probably called a week ago.
Right.
Or they're the people that are the planners and really are looking to war game a potential situation they know is coming up. You know, if you're dealing with an appropriations issue, you know that's going to come up in the spring, and you can plan for that. Now, if you had a reporter call and blow up an investigative story, you can't plan for it.
Right.
But either way, there's an opportunity to impact the crisis and help you get through it so that you can ultimately weather the storm and get back to business.
Right. I mean, and you also talk about operational challenges sometimes being mistaken for PR problems, and I thought that was really interesting. I think you mentioned that in a recent Forbes article. How'd you uncover that concept?
I did. I wish I could say it was something that I figured out on my own, but our firm's been around for about 30 years, and it's a pattern that you see pretty frequently. It's human nature to want to find someone to blame,
Right.
and when a problem plays out in the media, it's easy to call it a PR problem. But take an oil spill, for instance. You know, the Gulf oil spill was not a PR problem first and foremost.
Right.
There was oil leaking on the ocean floor. That's an operational challenge.
Correct.
And that's where people often see PR problems that really have a deep root in an operational issue that a company needs to deal with. Sure, you need to deal with the media, and you need to deal with the public, your customers, your key stakeholders, shareholders, etc. But ultimately, you got to plug the hole.
And do you see that maybe sometimes customers or people who might be going through a crisis will have a knee-jerk reaction, and once it's no longer the top headline, maybe they think it's over and we can go back to business as normal, and really that's not the case, I'm sure.
Absolutely. I mean, sure, it's great to see the headlines recede. One of the most wonderful things about the changing media landscape is things don't last for that long. They might come back, but you usually get a bit of a breather. But just because the press subsides doesn't mean you don't have a problem to deal with. Mm-hmm. And if you don't make changes for the long term, you're going to deal with it again. And my advice to my clients usually is if you have a problem once, you'll have it again. And you also should war game potential problems that could be similar or completely different, because you need to be prepared and expect the unexpected.
Right. Stay right there. We'll be right back with more from Anne Marie Malecha.
The Black Student Fund has been around for more than 50 years, and it served as an important resource for many, many families in the area who may not have always felt welcomed to independent schools. For school heads and administrators like me, it's a bit of a party and celebration coming to this, not only seeing other school personnel, but to meet so many families, some of whom have traveled from a distance, and I think they know that this is the one fair where they're going to see all the schools in the area.
Independent schools are such a wonderful resource for all the families, but particularly for families of color who may not have necessarily access that we need them to have. So this is a place where you can literally see every kind of education possible in the independent school world. So we have to give everyone an equal playing field. Black Student Fund allows us to do that.
We provide more insight into the admissions process, which has become more complicated than 50 years ago, so that families understand what they're going to have to do to actually apply to schools, complete the testing that's required for admission to the schools, and to position themselves through the financial aid process.
What I'm trying to get out of it is just basically making sure that I can give him better than what I had when I was growing up, and giving him a better start and the best education that I can give them all.
Luke is a special kid. He's pretty advanced, so we were looking for something that's affordable that we could get him in.
Today is a day where people learn that there is hundreds of millions of dollars of financial aid that's given out by these schools. Today is a day of people making connections about their dream for their kids.
I would say that the Washington, D.C. area may have some of the most diverse independent schools in the country, and I think there's a direct link with the Black Student Fund. I think it's been transformative for many individuals, but also for the schools.
This episode of Think Big is brought to you by the SOAR Community Network. Find them online, soarcommunitynetwork.com, and ask about the Launchbox.
Okay, so, yeah.
Welcome back to Think Big. I'm your host, Akia Garnett, and I'm joined by Anne Marie Malecha, and she is Senior Vice President at Dezenhall Resources. And we're talking about crisis management. So, Anne Marie, what problems or mistakes are brands finding themselves in today?
I think a lot of brands are hamstrung by the fact that they really want to placate their critics. And at the end of the day, you're never going to please the people that really dislike you. And your goal should be to talk to the audience that matters to you, your stakeholders, your customers. Sure, you're going to have to put some messages out there that address what your critics are saying. Mm-hmm. But, you know, if you have animal rights activists that aren't your biggest fans, say you're a commercial farming operation, you're never going to make PETA happy.
Right.
And that's something that you have to understand. Mm-hmm. And I think there's this attitude of really wanting everyone to like you and to not have to deal with any negative attention. And the reality is that's just never going to be the case.
Right. I mean, one of the reasons why I wanted to bring you on as my guest is because I was in an actual workshop or a training that you did. I was late coming into all the fun, but what I did here, I was really inspired by. You were saying some things that are not commonly said when it comes to crisis management. I think that placating is, one way of putting it when it comes to, those adversaries out there. But when brands are even internally talking about crisis, it's kind of scary. People don't want to really deal with it, and they just want to, kind of pray that it goes away and they can get back to being happy or whatever they are inside their organization. Once these crises, happen and you've got leadership that's also internally, pulling their hair out and trying to figure out what to do. Do you think it's just best to apologize, and or does that make things worse?
Apologies are something that most PR practitioners say you absolutely have to do. You should apologize and be transparent. I am going to take the very unpopular belief that that is not the case. The short answer is yes and no, but if you make a broad-based apology, generally that opens you up for litigation and claims to be made against you that you ultimately can't stand up against.
Right.
Now, if you can apologize like Toyota or GM did during their recent scandals, you can say, I apologize for causing my customers
Right.
challenges. That doesn't stand up in court. But if you apologize, you usually end up fired or in litigation.
Wow. I mean, and that's contrary to, many brands that might put out such transparency statements and wanting to be, of course, on the up and up with their shareholders and stakeholders. How do you help people balance all of that when you might have, a brand that wants to issue an apology or not, and you've got stakeholders or shareholders who are really just adamantly for or against something?
I'm not advocating to not take responsibility for things. That absolutely won't get you anywhere, but the way you do that needs to be really strategic and really measured, and the way you communicate that with your stakeholders is not necessarily going to be a one-size-fits-all approach. It would be nice to say keep the lawyers out of the room, but at the end of the day, that's not realistic, and that's something that businesses really do need to consider. You do want to give your customers or your stakeholders enough information so that they understand really what's going on. But at the end of the day, transparency only serves the people that are outside your organization to do more harm against you when you can't give the facts that are ultimately going to make them happy.
Right. I mean, and when you say things, like that, I know it's like you said, you're going to be on the opposite end of what most people would expect you to say or expect someone in crisis management to say. But what you're saying is so true. It's just difficult, I think, to hear. How do you help people actually accept what you say so that they can move to putting a solution in place?
So much of it is about slowing down and looking at the process start to finish. You can't walk into a situation and plan exactly how every step is going to go, but when you can show that after you get through this initial phase, there's more work to be done, and ultimately you get to the point where you can get back to doing whatever your business does best.
Right.
That's really how I help my clients understand how to get to that point.
Right. I mean, what might some of that look like once the actual, we talked about earlier, it's out of the headlines, and they're really going to get into some of the tactical nitty gritty of solving some of the challenges that might have, created the eruption, if you will. What does that look like on your end in terms of helping them roll out some kind of solution?
Sure. I mean, it really depends on what the issue is, but a lot of times it's ally education and getting folks in your corner so that if you have a challenge happen in the future, you've got people to come to your aid. There's also a fair amount of reputation management that has to be taken on, whether that's dealing with your members of Congress or agency staff or SEO work, and really seeing what your public image looks like out there.
Right.
Sometimes it's firing consultants and bringing in new folks that understand your new strategy and why that's important. A lot of times it's dealing with your internal stakeholders. The internal rumor mill can be far worse than outside outlets 9 times out of 10. And
Right.
if that's not something you can get a hold of, it's really hard to make operational change and have a cultural shift within an organization without having that buy-in.
Is it possible to fight fair and come out unscathed nowadays?
Define fight fair. I think fighting fair for my clients is doing whatever within their legal and tactical ability to ensure that they're able to continue to operate. And ultimately, I think you can come out unscathed, but it's important to define at the outset of a crisis what unscathed looks like.
Okay.
And if you think that's comfort and joy, it's not. It's going to be uncomfortable. It's going to be painful. It's probably going to cost you some money. And you want to be able to get through it as fast as possible,
Right.
as successfully as possible, so then you can get back to doing whatever it is you do best, making widgets or, selling services to whomever.
Right.
But it doesn't feel good.
I mean, and you talk about stopping the bleeding, that hemorrhaging, if you will, and just, of course, putting that solution in place. But how long can those solutions, go on?
Well, it really depends. If you look at, say, the oil spill
Right.
example we were talking about, it took a while for them to literally plug that hole. And until you can really stop the bleeding and get past the discovery phase or the, uncovering of what an issue may be,
Right.
You really can't get to the point of addressing it and moving on. And that could be 2 days or that could be 2 years.
Do you think that most crises can be dealt with?
Absolutely. I mean, if you look at old economy companies, the GEs of the world, many of the airlines who have faced all kinds of crises over the years, they haven't gone away. They have to reinvent themselves or shift or move with the markets. But ultimately, you can survive a crisis, but you have to be able to take a pretty decent amount of pain.
Well, I mean, okay, so we've talked about this, and I think we're pretty much talking about it from a bigger company or organization perspective, a company that has some kind of a budget, a company that is prepared, if you will, or not, to manage themselves through a crisis. But what about the small business owner who just doesn't have a clue, is going into business and they've created some new product or whatever, and all of a sudden they become the object of scrutiny and the object of an attempt to be pulled down. What about them? How can they protect themselves or even create some kind of plan or process or something?
It doesn't matter what your size is, crisis can really strike anyone. And I think smaller companies often think that they're kind of flying under the radar, and many times they are. But the reality is if you're in a market where you have competitors, you have motivated adversaries. You have people that are invested in not seeing you succeed. And the things that I find are most beneficial, particularly for small organizations, is to war game out what those potential scenarios are. And, if you've got a leadership team of 4 people, make sure that your leadership team of 4 people sits down once or twice a year and examines what those situations are and how you're going to react to them. A lot of what I do with my clients when they're not in crisis is walk them through the scenarios of, okay, if this happened tomorrow, what would we do? Who does what? How are they going to do that? What are the steps we need to take? And in drilling, essentially, and practicing it, you can really see where people's strengths are and where the things you need to work on so that when you get into a crisis, you can move through it as quickly as possible.
Right. So, I mean, in your mind, is it more complicated than it is simple, or vice versa?
It's more complicated than it is simple, but at the end of the day, the goal generally is the same. You want to get through it, you want to move on, and you want to not see me again for a little while.
Right.
And that's something that can be done if you're willing to put your head down, roll up your sleeves, and endure a little pain.
Right. I mean, I've heard you say that also at the end of the day, you just want to stop the attacker. You want to stop the aggression.
Absolutely. And I think that's something that a lot of organizations don't think about, particularly on the public affairs side. If you've got a motivated adversary that's coming at you, that could be a regulator that has, a piece of policy that's buried deep into a bill that nobody else really cares about, but ultimately could impact your ability to, ship products or move raw materials. That's a big deal, and that's something that you have to address. And fighting back isn't a bad thing.
Right.
Fighting back is having, the right folks in your corner and having the strategy and the will to keep punching.
So, do you have any real, niche, if you will, in crisis management, or is it more general? I'm just trying to get a feel for some of the challenges that you might have helped people walk through.
Sure. So we really work in all industries, pharmaceutical and healthcare, tax and trade, finance and technology, and just about everything in between. But, one crisis is not the same as another, and the one-size-fits-all approach is just not something that I believe in.
Right.
While you can take lessons learned from other crises of the past, each one is its own animal, and each one needs to be addressed with a full landscape analysis to see what you're up against.
Right. You love your work.
I do. It's really fun. It's tough to see clients dealing with challenges that really impact their day-to-day, but to be able to have them come to me with a problem, find a strategy and a set of tactics that ultimately get us to a solution, whether that's 6 months or 2 years, is really great.
I mean, and at the end of the day, you are dealing with humans. They're people. Might be their brand that's in trouble, but it's a person behind the phone or whatever. And I'm sure it must be required of you to be empathetic all day long when you're dealing with your clients and some of the challenges that they must be facing.
Absolutely. I mean, we call it the client-counselor relationship because though I'm dealing with crisis management and public affairs, there's a big part of what I do that has a therapeutic value to it as well.
Right. And where can find you online?
At www.dezenhall.com. You can find me on Twitter at Anne Marie FM.
Great. Thank you so much for being on the show.
Absolutely. Thank you for having me. This has been great.
Absolutely. Stay right there. We'll be right back with Bernard Coleman. Welcome back to Think Big. I'm your host, Akia Garnett, and I'm joined in the studio by Bernard Coleman III. He is the global head for diversity and inclusion for Uber. I'm sure you're familiar with that brand. I am so excited because I met this gentleman in graduate school. He and I went through our MBA program together in a cohort. There was myself and Bernard and a few other wonderful, wonderful professionals. And we just had a chance to bond. And so it's wonderful to just see how you're doing in your career and all these great things that you've got going on. Bernard, thank you so much for being my guest on Think Big.
Thank you. I'm glad to be on the show today. Thank you for inviting me.
Global Head of Diversity and Inclusion for Uber. That's huge. What all does your role entail?
So it's basically about culture shifts. It's about making sure that we have an environment that's diverse, inclusive, it's filled with belonging, and making sure our staff feel supported. So that's across the individual level, that's across our systems, that's across our leadership.
Right.
It's also making sure we're also looking to make our diverse suppliers a bigger deal. So it's very multifaceted, and we're always thinking about where do you start and what do you do first.
Right. I mean, and how do you define diversity and inclusion in today's world of so much?
So the underpinning of what we're trying to do is about a term called intersectionality, and when we think about diversity, it's about difference. It's about all the different things that you bring to the table. I'm a black man. I'm a Christian. I come from a different socioeconomic background. So you have to think at all the diversity of difference and all those things that you bring to the table, because the important value at Uber is being yourself. Mm-hmm. So you can bring your complete self to work. And then there's inclusion, which is, do I feel welcome when I come to work? Do I feel like I belong? So we like to think about diversity, inclusion, belonging, and support, or I call them DIBS.
I was looking at some of the past work you've done with other interviewers, and one of the things that you mentioned was that employees at Uber really didn't feel safe or supported. How did you all, or how are you all moving to create some solutions for that?
It's about creating safer spaces. So the first thing is, I think, is establishing trust and giving them support spaces. We have employee assistance programs. We have a thing called Lyra Health, but we have a lot of different support structures. We have our employee resource groups. You have the diversity inclusion team. There's about 7 of us in total. But we want to make ourselves a resource so that staff feel, one, heard, but supported is the most important thing.
So you have a very big job to do, and not without media scrutiny, of course. You've got a lot of friends out there and fans, or as our prior guests mentioned, motivated adversaries out there who are excited to talk about Uber. And you entered Uber at a very interesting time, a time of challenge for the brand and culture, of course, which has created its own following. How do you summarize your first 6 months on the job?
The best word is a roller coaster. I came in, I had about a week reprieve, and then delete Uber happened, and a number of other things occurred that basically created a cultural awareness. I'm calling it an inflection point in our organization. So we had to have the sunshine shine on what we're doing, which is the best antiseptic. So we basically went way up, and now we had our ups and we had our downs, and now I think we're at the point where we're trying to get to Uber Plus.
And you mentioned that things can be sensationalized in the media, and that things somewhat internally are a lot different than what they might be or look like on the blue screen, on the tube. What does that mean when you say that? Because I think most people do think that it's really a challenging place to be right now.
I mean, when I say sensationalized, there's pockets of things where things aren't going well, or it depends on your tenure, how long you've been there. Sometimes people have good experiences, sometimes people have bad experiences. But I think when it's compounded with the media cycle saying how terrible it is, I always say it's akin to if I weren't feeling well and somebody says you look sick, it's like it compounds and you feel that much worse.
Right.
Because one of the things I found that I really enjoyed, people were really passionate about diversity and inclusion. They felt good about their work. They felt that it was a positive. They were making a difference, right. And it felt like what it feels like on the inside versus what I'm hearing are two different things.
Right.
So it was like cognitive dissonance. So working through that, trying to understand what that means for folks.
Yeah, I mean, how did you actually get to the answers? Because I know you mentioned that part of your early work was just getting in and listening before you decided to make any decisions or put anything in place.
Assessments. I talked to anyone. I had a list of all the people I wanted to speak with, and then people would put time on my calendar. Hey, I'd love to talk to you. And people were very frank, and they were very upfront, like, this bothers me, or I think this is unfair, or I think this is right, or I love this, or I dislike that. And basically, we just compiled and had focus groups and listening sessions, and we basically really wanted to understand what our staff were feeling. And then we took all those things and tried to get prescriptive based upon what their needs were, as opposed to making a blanket statement or a blanket approach to what we thought was wrong versus listening to what our staff really were calling on us to do.
Right. I mean, it must be a really big thing to manage. You've got almost or over 14,000 employees for Uber, right? And that doesn't count the drivers and the suppliers and all the other people out there that somewhat are connected to the brand.
Mm-hmm. 14,000 people. So, and that's when I talk about the media, like, to understand what it is to scale, we're growing at an astronomical rate and trying to be mindful of making sure we have diverse and inclusive lens when we hire and all the practices that we do, and trying to make sure that we're intentional and deliberate. And that's that careful dance you have to do, because you want to also make sure the culture's sustainable. And that's what we're trying to do now, and put things in place so that way we get to Uber Plus and people feel safe, supported, proud to work at Uber.
Right. I mean, can you talk more about whatever you call that earlier?
So basically, it's intersectionality. So intersectionality it's a term that it's the underpinning of everything. So when we think about the work that we're doing, we want to talk about, I have multitudes. I'm a man, I'm black, I'm Christian. So you can't look at people in isolation. They have
right.
different multitudes, different things that make them themselves. And when those things are compounded, there's systems of oppression that can happen. So if I happen to be a woman of color who might be a veteran, who might be LGBTQ, there's a number of systems that might oppress me and make my experience different. And we have to look at those multitudes when we look at everything. So one of our approaches is we're looking at intersectionality and making people understand it's not the struggle Olympics. It's like, not my plight is worse than your plight. It's how can we work together to try to solve for some of the larger problems we have. And then we're tying it back to Maslow's hierarchy of needs. 'Cause at the bottom of Maslow's hierarchy of needs is, do I feel safe? And if we go to the base levels of where everybody wants people want to feel safe, and so that's our starting point.
Wow, I mean, and the division or the set of groups of people with different backgrounds and so forth is just so broad now. It's not black and white. It's not male and female. You know, it's not just gender. It's not just race. It's not just ethnicity. But there are so many other things that are now compiled, you know, upon all of those things, making it very complex to even, for some people to even define, you know, what box they feel like they fit in.
But that's the beauty.
Yeah.
And that if we can bring all those folks, and what we want them to do is be themselves and bring their ideas to the table. So that way you can, I always like to talk about message meets market. So if you have different folks with different views bringing their best ideas because they feel good about the work they're doing, because they feel like they can bring those ideas forward, and because they can belong, your message meets market better versus having one homogenous view. Because obviously that's a failing path forward. You want to have all the different views, people that feel the ability to speak up, and then they can really be impactful.
I mean, you know, switching gears a little bit, it must be something having your former boss say that Uber isn't really maximizing opportunities for women. You were working for Hillary for the campaign. You know, kudos to you for that. That's a massive undertaking. And so you kind of moved from a really, really big thing to another really, really big thing. Are you able to translate some of those things that you did for the campaign to what Uber is dealing with?
It's still the same toolbox. You just have to figure which tools you're using and what degree you use them, for how long. Because she's right, like we aren't creating enough opportunities for women. We aren't creating opportunities for a lot of folks. So we have to think about it. What tools will help people get to equitable treatment and equity in terms of in terms of the workplace? And the most important thing is fairness. Do I feel like I'm being treated fairly? And a lot of people, there's this great study by Frida K. Klein, and it's called the Tech Leaver Study. And it talks about people leave for various reasons, and fairness shows up for different reasons for different people. So like for you might say there's not enough coffee in the break room, and I might go there's not enough pay, you know, like, and so it varies for folks. And so it's understanding what those levers are and why people leave.
I mean, how long or what does your implementation plan look like? Because you came in, you established what your research was going to be, and you kind of rolled that out. And 6 months later, you know, you've already launched a diversity report, right, and put some numbers out. What's next?
So we basically we're looking short-term and long-term. So we're thinking next 6 months, what can we do in the immediate, and then what are we doing over to end of year 2018? So it's basically thinking longitudinally, not like just what's in front of us. Because if you're going to do this in an intentional, deliberate way, you have to be thinking long-term. But in the immediate 6 months, I mentioned before, we're focusing on individuals. One thing that we're doing is called Inclusive Actions Index. Basically, we tested this out with our employee resource group. What does inclusion feel like? What would it make me feel more welcome at work? So we're working on making people feel included, because one of the things that I noticed when I first started Uber, people want to know, like, what can I do? I want to be a good colleague. I want to be a good ally, but I just don't know what to do. And people needed the tools. And so the Inclusive Actions Index is going to help folks like, oh, I didn't know my colleague, if I say this or I do this, would make my experience better. And so on an individual level, I'm feeling it. And it starts there, because you have to feel it. You know, it's more than just systems and leadership, but do I actually feel the changes that you're trying to set forth?
Would you say that most employees feel like there is a need for diversity and inclusion work?
Yeah, absolutely. That was the one thing I was happily surprised. They're like, I got all these ideas. Can I throw some time in your calendar? And they would just give me ideas. I take those ideas, add it to the overall plan, because I think the most important thing is, are you listening to what people are asking for, and are you incorporating into your plan? Because then it's just in time, as opposed to, you know, here's something off the shelf. This is what everyone's doing. No, we need to do what's prescriptive and what makes sense for Uber. I
mean, and I mentioned earlier that your timing was very interesting. I mean, with this whole, you know, TK thing, I know that's what you call him, not being there, and several key leadership positions being open. You know, what you're rolling out is something that has to have buy-in from the top. How are you going to sort of backtrack a little bit to get someone up to speed, those folks up to speed, when they're really in the places that, you know, will demand leadership and acceptance of what you're putting in place?
So, I mean, it's level setting. We're doing why D&I workshops throughout the company.
What's that?
It's basically, it's a primer for basically why is D&I important to Uber, and basically giving everyone this is the standard by which we're going to be judged, and getting everyone through this workshop. So we've already had 1,000 people go through the workshop, and we're trying to get the 90% of our managers through the workshop by the end of the year.
Right.
And basically, if you give people what is D&I, why is it important, and everyone knows exactly we're all singing from the same song sheet, then we're more effective in terms of moving forward, because people have to have that aha moment in terms of the realization of this work and why it's important.
And you said that, you also found that people were just looking for leadership. It's very interesting because you said that the majority of the managers, right, or a high percentage of them have never managed before.
Mm-hmm. So I believe it's 63%. So it's a high percentage of people who have never managed before at Uber, and we basically want to make sure they're upskilled. They basically need the tools so they can be successful, and that's what that's part of our mandate, making sure folks have the training and the workshops and all the support structures so that way they can be successful in their jobs. Because I think everybody wants those leadership skills and they want to be successful.
Right. You said 1,000 folks have already gone through. What does that training look like?
It's really neat. So basically, it just starts with D&I, but basically what we're trying to do is back into it, because I always talk about when people eat their vegetables. Sometimes they don't want to eat their vegetables. I always do it in the passive way. So put broccoli in the brownies. So that way it's kind of passive, and you have these aha moments as you go through the training and through the workshops, and then you kind of understand, like, wow, this is what this work means. And we have excellent learning and development staff who are taking it through the training, and there's a guy on my team who's doing it, and it's basically really helping them understand and unpack that.
Right.
And then they leave understanding more, and we have them do pre-work, like an implicit association test, to like understand where their biases are, and they kind of go through that. So after they know their biases, they can call it out and see it, and it kind of it makes you look behind the curtain.
Wow. I mean, and from that, I mean, is there any follow-up, or how long does those trainings last? How long are they going through it?
So they go through it, and there's other subsequent trainings. So we have 3 trainings. There's 3 modules that they'll ultimately go through, and we're just cascading through, because the most important thing about workshops and trainings, like, trainings don't fix everything. People say, did you have the unconscious bias training like this magic bullet? It won't work.
Right.
Nothing in isolation works, so it has to be reinforced and giving people support structures and reminders, and so that way they're always being upskilled and learning more and more and more, and then grow and grow and grow. Otherwise, you have a failing venture. So you have to basically give all the people the resources through multiple channels to make sure they are supported and have those skills.
Wow. I mean, are you scratching your head every day saying, wow, how did I get here in Silicon Valley?
Yeah, I mean, it is amazing. It's been an amazing 6 months, really, really fast paced. It's so much like a campaign. It's almost the exact same thing, except it doesn't end.
Right.
There's no candidate. But yeah, it's fast paced. We have so much to do in so little time. Everyone's, rearing to go, and they're just like, give me my tools. I got to go, upskill me, teach me the way. And, what can I, everybody just wants to be really impactful, because what I found is everyone just wants to learn and be better.
So when you were winding down your time on the Hillary campaign, and you were making your transition to move out to San Francisco after a while, how did you, kind of put one thing to rest so that you could move on to this beautiful role that you're in right now?
I didn't have a moment to breathe. I remember my last day in the campaign was 12/31/2016. I signed my offer letter in December of 2016, and then we had to sell our house. And I started January 17th. So it was really like I started painting and doing maintenance in the house, and my wife and I just really got to work, and we're just thinking about the transition. I was in California for a month, and then we moved here on President's Day. So my wife and my 2 daughters, we all just moved, and we just left Virginia behind, and here we are.
Wow, and it's just such a different change of life and everything. I mean, it's one thing to visit, the West Coast. It's another thing to just upward move there. And
yeah, it was abrupt, but it was like it was a real blessing. It was the right time, right place, and I think I feel really privileged to be here at this moment, and so I can be helpful in terms of this overall culture shift that we're trying to do.
Uber does touch. It touches so many people, and we talked earlier about those 12,000, and 14,000 employees rather. You got how many drivers just in the United States?
I believe it's 700,000. So there's a lot of drivers in the United States. People, all these different folks using our platform in various ways, and so we touch on so many lives. And it's important that we are respectful and honor that. And so I think by having a more diverse and inclusive workforce, it permeates and impacts everything that we do.
And everything that you do, how are you also working to make sure that the solutions that are put in place, the trainings that are going forth, the culture, and everything extends itself to do something good for all of the different people who Uber impacts, and that would include your customers, your drivers, your suppliers, your employees. How is everything going to come together so that everybody is in a better position after your work is really in place?
We measure everything. Everything has to have a measurement. Otherwise, it almost doesn't matter. So if we don't measure or assign a value to it, then you can't see the results because it's unclear. So that's the difficult part with D&I. A lot of times people don't understand how to measure it, so we're trying to get very creative. Like, what is this value? How do we assign it? And my team's amazing in terms of like mapping out the project plan. What does it look like? What's the measurement? What does success look like? And making sure we're successful in those endeavors. So it's just really working together and really having a tight project plan and sticking to the plan, because plans don't work if you don't follow them. So and then we pilot a lot of things, like pilot to see if it works and then scale it.
Right. I mean, when you really came up with your plan, the thing that you were going to implement after you did your analysis, how did you actually determine what those steps were going to be?
So, I mean, the plan changed slightly because as each thing came about, you have to adjust based upon the landscape. But after that, you do ease of implementation. Like, what can we do now? What can we do in a month? What can we do in 2 months? What can we do on a parallel track?
Right.
Who can we pull in to help? And so at first there was a task force, and as my team built up, we got people assigned to different things, and basically you just got more and more tactical and more strategic in terms of how you use your resources, so that way you can work on multiple fronts. But it really is about like what makes the most sense now, and really understanding what is a priority and what's not so much a priority.
I think there's a grim cloud right now over Uber, whereas people think that the halls are just, filled with people running and it's chaotic and it's in a mess. Is it a fun place to work?
It is. It's very exciting. You have a lot of autonomy. Like you're creating something. Like even this whole D&I plan, like people are going to look back and say like either they did well or didn't do it well. And I think that's what will be judged. And I think that's very exciting to be able to like chart out your destiny, getting input from all these different folks, and really try to be impactful. So I think it can be fun. It can be stressful. It really is like, it's really harried. And it's just like, go, go, go. And I think what I always tell people, like, this is a magical moment in an organization. You have people, all these different openings within the company, and this is the time to come to this organization. You could be part of helping in this culture shift and helping be part of what I'm sure is going to be an interesting business case for many, many generations.
Absolutely. So when it comes to diversity and inclusion and Uber, what does it look like tomorrow?
The goal is to be the top spot. I mean, technology is notoriously great at creating things like widgets and autonomous vehicles and all these different innovations in the gig economy, but no one has done it perfectly in diversity and inclusion. People do bits and pieces well, and the goal is to be the leader in diversity and inclusion. That's the goal.
Right. One group of people who I'm sure Uber would want to attract is women in technology. Mm-hmm. And I know that there has been, was a recent article, and whereas women in technology were just not feeling very comfortable and welcome there. Mm-hmm. I'm hoping that at the end of the day, the work that you're doing will bring them back into the fold, mm-hmm. and many other groups of professionals, not even mentioning, when it comes to what our makeup is biologically, but professionally, the diversity that Uber needs in order to thrive and move to the next level once it is a much more healthy organization and brand internally. I hope that you are able to really help bring those folks back into the fold.
I'm confident we can do it. We have a lot of great people working really, really hard, sharing all their ideas. And like I said, we're trying to bring those ideas to the fore and making sure that they can see their great work, and then by word of mouth, let people know, like, hey, it's safe. Come on over. We need your talents, mm-hmm. and we would love to have you here at this critical moment, because this inflection point, it's what we're going to be judged by, and I think people want to be part of that.
Because I went to school with you and I've worked with you on several projects. I know that you are a hard driver, that you push yourself really hard. You're a perfectionist. What timeline have you given yourself? I know that you've got those internal timelines and you've got people outside of the organization also looking at you, but what are you driving toward?
I'm looking at 6 months. I mean, the things that I really am really trying to focus on, the inclusion index, making sure our systems are more efficient, but more so digging really into recruitment. Like, I really want to know the recruitment experience, and I want to make sure people have a great experience. Like, I don't want to lose you at hello, but like, what brought you in? Right. What was your interview experience? What keeps you there and make people feel supported? I'm really interested in the recruitment experience, because I think that's the first touch anyone's ever going to have. And if they don't have a good experience, and later on they'll say like, I was treated terribly or I was treated wonderfully, you should come here. I think that's everything right now. And then also doubling down on inclusion. So you at the same time, the recruitment strategy and then making sure people feel welcome and want to stay for the long haul. So it's a two-sided coin, but I think both of those things are very, very important. So I think the next 6 months are going to be super critical.
Wow. Well, is there anything that you want to share regarding your experiences at Uber?
I would just encourage people, if you want an exciting adventure and you really want to test your mettle, this is the place to come. And I would say this is the moment to do it. This is when there's all these openings. And I just want to remind people, even though we're a technology company, we're highly operationalized to support the platform. Other vocations are needed: lawyers, accountants, people in finance. So just don't think because it's a tech company I can't work here. There's a place for you, and we encourage you to apply. There's lots of jobs all around the world, and we want to welcome you to come work at Uber.
Right. Well, did you take an Uber here?
I did. That's all I do.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Bernard, for being on the show. And thank you for the work that you're doing inside Uber. I'm excited to see how all those great things that you're doing is going to come to fruition. I know it's going to be for the better of not just the employees, like I mentioned earlier, but anybody who Uber touches, and that includes me. Yeah. So, because I'm a fan, I do take an Uber every once in a while. So
yeah, it's how I get from point A to point B.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, you've been watching Think Big. I'm your host, Akia Garnett. Thank you so much for joining us. Thank you to Anne Marie Malecha, who is the Senior Vice President for Dezenhall Resources. And thank you so much to Bernard Coleman III, who is the Global Head for Diversity and Inclusion at Uber. See you next time.